right. So, hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope that you all had a very restful spring break. I know I did, caught up on some good TV, and it has been exciting. So, I'm so glad that you all are able to join me this week for Race and Racism and Mental Health. I'm Dr. Janelle Robinson, and I will be with you all week. So just to talk a little bit about what we'll talk about today, I'll do a brief introduction just so you know who I am, what my experiences are. We'll go over historical roots of racial disparities in mental health. We'll talk about psychological impact of racism, multiculturalism, multicultural counseling, review of some terms that'll be really helpful to know. If I can go to the next page, white privilege, stigma and mistrust, advocacy, multicultural social justice, counseling competencies, systems, implicit bias, and impact of racism on clients. So I know it might sound like it's a lot, but you know, the way we'll engage in the discussion, I think it'll be fun. So who am I? I think it's always important to know if you go to any kind of class or a webinar, just like who the individual is, what their experiences are. And I thought this was just a little bit of a different and fun way to introduce myself to everyone without just sitting in here and you guys looking at me and me just talking to you. And I will also note that this kind of pictorial genogram kind of thing can be really helpful in the helping field. So for those of you that are counselors or social workers, peer support, any kind of helpers, this can be really helpful when working with clients. And I'll just kind of quickly go, and I hope you guys can see my mouse as I go to different things on the screen. So I'll just start off. I'm sure you see this beautiful Steelers sign here. I am from Pittsburgh, born and raised in Pittsburgh. And that's also Pittsburgh down here with this little trolley car. This is actually our downtown, and we have our three rivers. We have our three rivers that convene here at the Point. Beautiful city. But yeah, born and raised in Pittsburgh, and always knew, I think, how I got to the field of counseling and counselor education is that I gave great advice, right? I think that's many people's stories when they talk about how they got into the helping field, right? At 15 to 16 years old, the best advice that you can give at 15 to 16 years old. But I was really good at that, I felt. And so it was in that moment that I wanted to be a counselor, and since high school. So I went to Tennessee State up here in my left-hand corner, Tennessee State, which is a historical Black college in Nashville. I come from a long line of HBCU students and supporters. My husband went to Morehouse, so we're a big HBCU family. Graduated from there, went back home to Pittsburgh, and I was working at a grassroots agency. And it was called Community Empowerment. And sorry again, it was called Community Empowerment. And this image with the people, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse right under Adult Black Educator. That's what that kind of symbolizes to me, like that community and how important it is. I was a family intervention specialist. I worked in the communities. I worked with children. I worked with their families. It was the inner city of Pittsburgh, predominantly Black. And it was really significant because it's the community that I was born and raised in. You know, so it was really kind of full circle to be able to come from this community, go to school, come back home, and get a job in that very community. And that wasn't necessarily anything I planned to do, but it just happened that way. And I think it really was beneficial because I wasn't an outsider, right? I was someone that was from there. And if we go over here to this is a Sankofa symbol, this bird, and the bird is looking back to the egg on its back. And to me, it just symbolizes you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been, right? And that's well, that is what it means. So it's not that it's just to me, that's what the symbol means. But that's really important for me, as an individual, as an African-American woman, that I was able to give back to my community, the community that I came from. And then we'll just kind of go over here to this tree with the roots. Just in general, I've always been really aware of who I am as a Black woman, the experience of Black people in this country, migration. I'm just very aware of all that, really close ties to my family. And so that just kind of those roots, right? That just symbolizes like who I am, and just me growing and me blossoming. While I worked at Community Empowerment Association, I have this picture of Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary down here, who wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And that's here for many reasons. Number one, I actually got to meet her when she came to Community Empowerment. And, a lot of her work I later used in my dissertation when I was defending my dissertation. But just again, going back to that awareness of the experience of Black people in this country has just always been so extremely important for me. So while at Community Empowerment, I knew I wanted to get my master's, and I knew I had to do that in order to be a therapist. So I went to Carlow, which is here under this beautiful bowl of spaghetti. I went to Carlow University in Pittsburgh, and this is in a neighborhood called Oakland. And if anybody is familiar with Pittsburgh, ton of universities kind of really close together. So there's the University of Pittsburgh, Carlow, Carnegie Mellon, Duquesne, Chatham. So just a lot of schools that are really close to each other. But that was a great experience. And I was often the only Black person in class, or just one of few. And it would be so interesting because I had a lot of classmates that would have conversations of wanting to work in the Black community once they graduated, or wanting to work in the inner city, or wanting to work with individuals who were considered lower SES. And it was in those moments that I really started to conceptualize what it would look like for me to get my PhD. And train people, because what I do understand is that if you don't understand a people, if you don't understand their history, where they come from, what they've gone through, you're not going to be able to help them, right? You're not going to be able to reach them. So having that historical knowledge is extremely important. And so it was in that moment that I said, well, hey, like, why don't I train counselors? So that way, people are multiculturally competent. People are prepared to work with diverse populations in their counseling practice. And then also just to continue that research, I loved researching, just different things that are going on within the Black community, within poor communities in Pittsburgh. And that was something I was really interested in. I was always interested in how racism psychologically impacts people experiencing that continued racism. And so that's how I ended up here. I'm so sorry. That's how I ended up here. Let's try not to change the picture, at Duquesne University, this top right corner, my right, beautiful campus, also in like uptown Pittsburgh, like up from downtown Pittsburgh. And I received a PhD in counselor education and supervision. And so what that did was that prepared me to be an academician. It prepared me to continue my work as a counselor. And it also prepared me for supervision, and of course, any kind of like research and things like that. And so that led me to work at, several institutions in Pittsburgh and West Virginia. I taught at Alabama A&M in Huntsville, which is a historically Black college in Huntsville, Alabama, for several years in their counseling and psychology program. And then I ended up here at Lenore Ryan, where I'm the program coordinator and an assistant professor in the clinical mental health counseling program at the Columbia campus. So I'm over the clinical mental health program in the Columbia campus. And so that's who I am career-wise, right? But of course, we know that none of us are just one-dimensional. We have many parts of who we are in our identity. So if we go up here to the two people jumping the broom, I am married. I forgot to say the dope Black educator, right? That's where that comes from, because I am an educator and I am an academician. But I'm married. My husband is also a dope Black educator. He's an assistant principal at a middle school. And even this picture, this is not us jumping the broom, but this picture really represents the fact that in the Black community, a lot of times we will jump the broom. That signifies being able to start a new life together. So that's really important for me. If we go to this picture with the woman with the bags and the two children, I'm a mom. I have two children. They are 4 and 1. And yes, they often hang on me like that when they get home from school and daycare. And it's one of my, probably like my absolute favorite thing that I get to do is be mom, to my babies. And so I do love that. What else? I'm a foodie. That's this bowl of spaghetti over here. I love food and I love spaghetti. I love going to great restaurants and finding a good meal. I get very upset if my food is not good. I do enjoy cooking. I love feeding people. So that's always a great part of my day, having a good meal. And I enjoy watching TV. Like I said earlier, this is my spring break. So I caught up on several shows on Netflix, but it doesn't matter if it's Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or just regular TV. I enjoy a good program, just kind of takes my, you just get a break. And then I didn't have this woman here on the computer. I am still a clinician. So I do have a private practice. I provide teletherapy to individuals in South Carolina, not just Columbia, but the entire state. And so that's a big part of my career as well. So this is who I am. I hope this, gives you a little bit of insight into what brought me here. And now let's go ahead and dig into it. So I want to start off with this quote that just says, it's by Maya Angelou, and history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I just want you all to marinate on that a little bit and really think about what that means for you. And when we think about racism and mental health, that's the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. And we all should understand the history of race in our country. Racism is so ingrained in our country, the origins of our country. And I think that's a lot of the conversations that we're having today and that we've continued to have. And it almost kind of seems like there's peaks and valleys as far as like having the conversation on a larger scale. But there's many of us that have never stopped having that conversation about the impacts of it. But just knowing where we've been so we don't go back there. Right. So we're not repeating the same things over and over again, so we can move forward. And so that's how that speaks to me. So let's take a look at the historical roots of racial disparities in mental health. And so I know you guys have so far had some great speakers, talk about just the origins of racism and racism in different disciplines and different parts of society. And this is no different, right? So there's racism in the origins of mental health. This here is Benjamin Rush. He's considered the father of American psychiatry. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he had some very racist ideologies, but he was big in mental health. And so a lot of the origins and historical roots of, the field can be traced back to him. Samuel Cartwright. This individual may sound familiar as well. He was an American physician. He talked about drapetomania, which basically said that any slaves that tried to flee captivity that was an illness. So if there was an individual that wanted to run away, wanted to flee, flee captivity, that was an illness that needed to be treated by the slave master. Okay. Considered slaves, that there was a mental illness and they were lazy. And so again, these are the roots. Like when we're thinking about these racist ideologies, like these are some of the roots and some of the foundation of that. there's been a lot of conversation surrounding James Marion Sims, and I believe like his statue had been taken down from a few places, but he's what they consider the father of modern gynecology. He was the president of the American Medical Association, so let's keep that in mind, right, when we're talking about these roots. He was also the president of the American Gynecological Society, but he conducted experiments on enslaved women without any anesthesia, anything like that. And so, very horrific things that would be done. And so now there seems to be a reckoning. I guess you can consider it like a reckoning, and people wanting to take his statue down and his name off of buildings and things like that, rightfully so, because it was absolutely horrific. And so Michael Krauss, and I saw this and this really spoke to me. He's a professor, but what he said, and this is his direct quote, there is a deep history of ignorance around racism in the United States that ripples through our schools and our discourse and leads us to rely on time and patience to produce equity and justice when history shows again and again that this expectation is unrealistic. So let's talk about that psychological impact of racism. And so you may see, and this is for anybody. So this is not just, these are things that clients will experience. This is for any, just people experiencing racism, chronic stress, right? Daily stressors. I mean, the majority of people may not be able to conceal their racial identity, right? And so just to have something that's like every single day, you're worried about something, right? Getting pulled over, being followed, being accused of this, having to fight people's microaggressions, having to fight against people's implicit bias, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure for people to go through every single day. When we talk about the immense pressure, if we think about individuals of Asian descent, so especially when COVID, happened, how much pressure, how much discrimination they experienced. But there's, within that community, there's this like, they're the model minority. See my quote, quotations, but they're the model minority. Right. And how much pressure that puts on somebody that you're trying to put a whole group of people in a box. They're the ideal whatever. And if you go outside of that, then what happens? So just tons and tons of pressure. It impacts self-esteem, it impacts self-worth, can cause tons of anxiety, weakened immune system, just issues with blood pressure, so all kinds of issues that people can encounter because of experiencing racism. And so I know you all have probably seen this image before, and you may have seen it, within this course that you guys have taken over the past few weeks as well. But I like this picture, and I think this sums up just the difference. We have equalities, as you see. You have, three different people. You have little tiny thing right here, and they have the same blocks, right? So that's equal because everybody's given the same blocks, but everybody doesn't need the same blocks because they're not the same size. So you have to fit. You have to make something fit each individual person, and so this is what equity looks like. And it's so interesting because I often have this conversation with parents, because one thing I'll hear parents say is, well, I treat all my kids the same. Like I treat everyone the same, so you have, multiple children and maybe there's some turmoil between the children or just anything like that. And then but you can't treat everybody the same because everyone is not the same. And so you do have to cater to each individual child, right? Because everybody is going to have different needs. And so that's so important to remember. And of course, again, we get into historical pieces and historical racism and historical trauma. There's a video that I think I have in my recommended list by Kimberly Jones in response. I think it was around the time that the George Floyd protests and things like that were happening, and she compares the Black experience to Monopoly. So definitely, I encourage you to watch it. It's just a few minutes long. But yeah, we have to take into consideration all of those things that, have been done to a group of people, that has been done to an individual, and really tailor our responses to that. So what is multicultural counseling? So it is counseling that integrates cultural identities, takes into account their influence of the counseling relationship process and outcome. So ultimately, multicultural counseling is counseling, right? It's so interesting how sometimes it seems like, well, I'm going into multicultural counseling, like it's a different kind of part, a subgroup of counseling. Like it's the same thing as saying, well, I'm going to work in, addictions, or I want to work with children, or I want to work with couples, and I want to work in multicultural counseling. Multicultural counseling is counseling. That is, no matter what population you're working with, you as a counselor will always and should always be doing multicultural counseling. So let's talk a little bit about the culturally competent helper. What does that mean? And so whether you are a counselor, or whether you are a social worker, or whether you are a psychologist or a peer person, a peer helper, you still have to be culturally competent. And so if we look at, again, when we're looking at these different theories in the field of counseling, we're thinking about clients and client issues, there was an assumption that they were similar in demographic. So there was an assumption that they were white, middle to upper class, heterosexual, I'm sure probably Christian, all of those things. And so we know that we live in a diverse society, and everybody is not going to fit, into that mold. So as a counselor, it's so important to be able to attend to the complexities of both, yourself as a counselor and clients and their cultural makeup, the systems by which they're surrounded, and we'll talk about systems in a little bit, and the impact those two components have on what earlier counselors and psychotherapists viewed as those universal expressions of mental health, right? So there are going to be some universal, similarities, but it always has to be understood in the context of someone's culture and someone's identity and their group membership. And so in the counseling professionals were challenging one another to address all of those personal biases, which can be really challenging, and assumptions that prevent them from forming and affirming therapeutic alliance with the clients that they counsel. And we'll talk about those biases as well. I'm just kind of keeping my eye on the time. So how does racism show up in counseling? It can show up in many ways. Ultimately, it can show up in the counselor's ignorance, right? Just not knowing that someone else has a different cultural lens as them, not understanding different concepts as it pertains to marginalized groups in this country, not having an awareness of their own biases and prejudices, and it's coming out in the counseling relationship. So those are the ways in which racism shows up in counseling. And that's why, a master's clinical mental health program is so important, because within the program, you're going to come out a lot different than you went in, right? Because in the program, it's designed, you have to go to counseling. You have to receive your own counseling. You're going to have so many reflection papers and addressing biases and talking about advocacy and creating advocacy plans, that you will know yourself so well by the time you leave your counseling program. And so just a few terms. So again, we go back to how does it show up? So it shows up when we don't have knowledge of some of these things that we're going to talk about shortly. So let's start with acculturation versus assimilation. right? Having the knowledge, like, what does this mean for an individual? So acculturation refers to adapting some aspects of the majority culture, but still being able to retain their own culture. And so that can, that can be people that have migrated to the United States. That can be people, maybe they're from this community that looks, like them, and then maybe they've gone to a different community where, there's no one that looks like them, or going to a new school. I mean, so there's a lot of ways in which we can talk about acculturation, people migrating within the country, going from state to state, going from, different cities, things like that. Assimilation refers to the loss of one's own culture and adopting the beliefs of the majority culture. So I just want you all to think about that, right? Think about the impact of that. So you have someone that is in a new culture, a new setting, and has lost, right, pieces of themselves. And it may not be that it was necessarily voluntary. I have friends who are first generation born Americans, and their parents' last name was altered. They were not taught their native language, right? All of those things happen, right? And a lot of it, I'm sure can be for protection, not wanting individuals to be, picked on, or not wanting to stand out. I mean, like, so many people and families can have different reasons for that. Some of it can be forced, right? Let's go back into history. We talk about racism in this country. Now, there were many racial groups in this country and other countries, who were forced into camps in which, they were forced to, adopt whatever that majority culture is. We're not able to use their language. We're not able to practice their customs or traditions without having some kind of penalty. So again, that is really steeped in racism. Cultural dimensions. So we talked about universal things just a few slides ago. So it's so important to understand this, right? Again, how does racism show up? Racism shows up in mental health when we don't have this awareness, when we don't understand that there's universal culture, group culture, individual culture, right? So that universal culture are kind of like the human connectedness. So things that just maybe human beings may share in general. Group culture are going to be characteristics shared by cultural groups or subgroups, and individual culture are going to be those behaviors and attitudes that are unique to specific individuals. And so oftentimes, even as a clinician, one thing that I see is the group and the individual culture kind of butt heads. Right. So, for example, let's say someone grew up in the Catholic faith, and that is the foundation for just maybe like who they are, their thoughts, how they operate, in the world. But they grew up and they decided no longer to practice that, right? And so now they have their own behaviors and attitudes that are very specific to who they are at that point. And then that might kind of clash with that group culture, those characteristics that was, within that specific faith. And so that's something that often has to be unpacked, and that we can do that in therapy. Everybody still with me? Okay. So you have your Edict and Eminence perspective. So Edict focuses on universal qualities common to all cultures. However, it doesn't take into account cultural variations. And Eminence focuses on the client as an individual and viewing the client from their own cultural lens. I just want to read that again, right? How does racism show up in counseling, right? When we do not focus on the client as an individual, and we're not able to view them from their own cultural lens. And that is so important to be able to do that. And so even if it's a culture that an individual is not, like a helper is not familiar with, tell me about that. Tell me about your faith. Tell me about your family. tell me about your cultural identity, because it is up to the helper to research and be aware of various groups, various racial groups, or whatever the marginalized groups is, sexual orientation and identity, religion, gender, any of that, SES. And so absolutely helpers can research and they can learn as much as they can about specific groups. But still, when we go back to, that individual, let's go back a slide. When we go back to this individual culture, so what we're looking at is maybe the group culture, right? That's the thing that we can learn about. We can look in journal articles, we can read books, we can do all of that. But that individual culture, that's why, as a helper, you want them to be able to tell their own story to you, and you want to learn about their culture from their own cultural lens. Individualism versus collectivism. So I think this is probably something that everybody is familiar with. So of course, individualism is that notion that behaviors and attitudes are guided by incentives that promote self-determination, independence, whereas collectivism, the focus is on the community and family, right? Being able to understand which does the client, which one really does the client identify with? What perspective, what kind of culture are they coming from? Again, maybe it's a culture that they grew up in, and maybe it's a different one now, but just being able to understand which one that they identify with now. Privilege and oppression. I feel like we've been having a lot of these conversations recently, and I'm sure in some of your other weeks being able to talk about that. So privilege, unearned, unconscious, access to resources, advantages, social positions based off of someone's cultural group membership. And then oppression is going to refer to the lack of power, inaccessibility of resources, disadvantage, and minority social status. So again, have to understand this. How do we keep racism from coming into mental health? By doing all of these things, having an understanding of privilege and oppression and collectivism and individualism and an edict and an emic. I mean, being able to have this knowledge. And that's why it was so imperative of me to go over these terms, because as a helper, you have to be able to internalize it, know what it means, and know how this may show up for your clients or the people that you're helping. Ethnocentrism or cultural encapsulation. So viewing your own culture as standard for normality. And so I really like this little picture that I saw. And of course, this is making very light of it, but it just says, perfect, really, no cuisine is as good as ours. Right? No cuisine is as good as mine, but in a sense, right, that's ethnocentrism, just being able to view it from your perspective of how you cook. Your food is the best. Your spaghetti is the best. Your pot roast is the best. Whatever it is that you make, yours is the best. And so everyone else gets compared off of that. And so that's a fun and lighthearted way to look at it. But there are going to be some individuals who look at that like culturally speaking. So whether it's, religion or spirituality or sexual identity or sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, that they can look at it, well, this is the one that I identify with. So everyone needs to identify with this one as well. And I'm basing it based off of mine. And that is dangerous, right? That's dangerous. We have to be really careful with that and recognize that I don't even use the word normal anymore. What I've realized is, as a clinician, I have really tried to remove the word normal from my from my head, because normal is so subjective. Right? Normal is based off of someone's own culture, and that's what you consider normal to be. And so I've been removing that in general. So I have this video, and I think it's really, it's 19 minutes long, and we won't look at it in this situation right here. But it's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she talks about, she's an author. She's written several books, and she talks about the danger of a single story. And I really want everyone to just take some time and watch it. And it's beautiful the way that she describes it. But it's, as we're talking about, what we just talked about, cultural encapsulation, this really like speaks to the impact of that. So definitely make sure you check that out. So let's just take a pause. And so I want to talk a little bit about white privilege and Peggy McIntosh. So what I've included, there's a link here. And so you guys will see, like, once you can click on that link. But she wrote Unpacking White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it was about in the 80s. And she is a white woman, and she was doing really trying to research and understand male privilege. I believe it was male privilege in the workplace. And what she ended up really identifying was white privilege. And so the work that she has done really since the 80s has been about white privilege, and I'm sure among other things, but the main thing that she's talked about, especially this Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, has been white privilege. And before you, it's a link, and there's an article, and there's about 26 questions. And it's really just to help you to assess your own privilege, right? And what things that, maybe things that you don't even think about, that you had access to, or that you had in general, that maybe other people, were not able to have. And so before you, click on that, and before you go into it, I do just want to read what she put, because I think this is really significant. My work is not about blame, shame, guilt, or whether one is a nice person. It's about observing, realizing, thinking systemically and personally. It is about seeing privilege, the upside of oppression and discrimination. It is about unearned advantage, which can also be described as exemption from discrimination. And there's several kind of little points that she points out when you look at the article. But that was the first one. I think that's really significant, before you go into it, but definitely click on that and check that out. And I've just provided a few videos. She did a TED talk, and then this was a local NBC affiliate. I think it was in Philadelphia. And she talked about white privilege, systemic racism, and implicit bias. And we are not going to have that pop up. So again, how are we keeping racism out of counseling? How do we keep it out of mental health? Understanding that there's still stigma and mistrust, right? Let me move the box. So counseling is still stigmatized in a lot of marginalized communities, understanding that, right? Understanding that everything that someone is experiencing in counseling and mental health, it may not always be like resistance to you as a counselor, or resistance to like not wanting to, get better in whatever their particular like presenting problem is. And a lot of it can be because it's still stigmatized, and it can be very uncomfortable to do something that maybe you don't necessarily feel supported from in your community. I want you guys to think about, so who do people talk to if not a trained professional? So we think about these communities, like who are some of the people that they talk to? I often talk to, artists, right? I'll say artists because I do think a hairstylist is an artist. I think a nail technician is an artist. I think a barber is an artist, so even when I'm talking to those individuals in those fields, a bartender, a waiter, like those are artists. But when I talk to them, they always talk about, like, oh my goodness, like people just come and they tell me their problems. And, like sometimes I feel like I'm a counselor, without that kind of training, because people will come and sit in my chair to get their hair done, or to get their nails done, or get their hair cut. And they're talking about their families and their trials and their tribulations and the things that they're struggling with. And they kind of become like a layperson, like a peer support person. So again, talking about stigma and understanding that in our field, counselors still do tend to be predominantly white. They are so predominantly white. And also recognizing that historical racist, sexist, classist, and heterosexist undertones, make up the counseling field. Advocacy is so important. That's a big part of what we do as counselors, as helpers in general, how you advocate for your client. So I want you just to think about this question, how might a counselor or any kind of helper advocate for their client? Why might they need to advocate for their client? What does that look like? And so we have the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. And, they talk a lot about advocacy and the importance of advocacy. And I just want to read something that they wrote in their description of those competencies. So privileged and marginalized counselors intervene with and on behalf of clients at the interpersonal, institutional, community, public, policy, and international global levels. And so I hope that all of you guys come back on Thursday. I hope that we can have a larger conversation about this, because I don't want to keep you too long in this format. But I just wanted to just kind of drop some jewels, right? And these might just be reminders. A lot of you guys, this might be things that you've already talked about and you already thought about, and it's just a reminder. So this is the Multicultural Social Justice Counseling competency. This is the figure that they've created, and it has, you see the 4 quadrants. And so you can have a privileged counselor with a privileged client, a privileged counselor with a marginalized client, or a marginalized counselor with a marginalized client, or a marginalized counselor with a privileged client. And so just being able to address, right, on all of these levels, the counselor self-awareness, being familiar, having an idea of the client worldview, that counseling relationship, counseling and advocacy interventions, what does that need to look like? And what are the actions? What are the skills? What are the trainings that the counselor needs to go to? The knowledge, how to increase knowledge, continuing to check at their own attitudes and beliefs throughout this entire process. And so I want to talk about systems very, very briefly, and just the importance of systems. So again, understanding that everybody may not come from an individualistic perspective, and you can have folks that are from a collective perspective. And so just being culturally competent, making sure that those prejudices and biases don't come into the counseling session. It is important to remember, the client's varying systems. And so Hayes and Erford, talked about 6 different systems that it's important to be mindful of. So on the individual level, with the client, family, friends, and peers, those community systems that they're connected to. So whether it's school, it can be church, it can be community agencies, such as the one that I worked at when I was right out of Tennessee State University, and of course that historical piece, like we talked about a few at the beginning of this, of our time together. And as you guys have been talking about for the past few weeks, that historical racism, that historical trauma, and why, it's so frustrating for me, and I'm sure for other people, when there's conversations that say, well, this thing happened, but this thing happened so long ago. How is it that people are impacted? No one here was alive when people were held in captivity, right? When people were enslaved, when Black people were enslaved. Why are we still having these conversations? And I will say that boils my blood, right? Because it's not an understanding of transgenerational trauma. Trauma changes you. Trauma changes your DNA. It changes for the descendants of people that have experienced that particular, that trauma and that continued trauma. And that's what we talked about. What's the psychological impact of stress, right? Continuous stress. there are Black people, brown people, indigenous people, people of color that have continued to experience racism for hundreds of years, right? For decades and generations after generation dealing with the same thing. It impacts people, it changes people's DNA. And it's so important to recognize that and to acknowledge that. And so these are the last few. So implicit bias. And so that is a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally. But it does affect judgment, decisions, and behavior. So, there's been a lot of like news stories and conversations, especially about like hiring practices and diversity in hiring practices. And I'm sure you guys have seen, where there's an ethnic, whatever that means, there's an ethnic sounding name and how that person, will get looked over for an interview, for a position or being offered a position. So how do we deal with that implicit bias, right? How do you make sure you're aware of it and you're actively dealing with it? And so again, how we see implicit bias in our society today, individuals of Asian descent and COVID, right? And I don't know how I think that's pretty like overt, for some people, overt and conscious in their bias and their prejudices, but just those thoughts, especially because we are still in this pandemic. Black folks just doing regular everyday things, walking your dog. Ryan Coogler, who directed Black Panther, he was just arrested just trying to take money out of his bank account. Watching birds, getting ice cream, shopping, moving in your house, moving out of your house, just regular things Black folks just can't do. Right. Individuals who identify as Muslims, especially after 9/11, like the implicit bias, in that community, from, outsiders and people thinking that anyone who is a Muslim is going to be associated with a terroristic group. Right. So those are some of those recent and ongoing episodes of what that looks like. I have included here, and again, I won't pull it up, but I want you guys to take a look at the implicit bias test. It is a study that you can access and go through it. It only takes about 10 minutes. There's different groups that you can kind of take this implicit bias and really is trying to help you to assess and ascertain like what biases you have towards what groups. So I think it has like, Black people, Asians, like different racial groups, so just check it out. It can be really enlightening and help you in doing that self-work that is so crucial and critical. So what do we do about it? Right? Everybody has biases. So what are some things that you can do? And I'll just kind of name off a few. Self-audits, checking in with yourself. And that's through your personal counseling, mindfulness, journaling, whatever it is you do, just check in with yourself. Call yourself out, right? Like call yourself out. If you realize that you're thinking something about somebody, you kind of realize that thought, is prejudice or bias, like just call yourself out regarding that. Get off of autopilot just because you grew up in a certain environment and a certain culture and people always just say that. That doesn't mean that you just continue to say it or continue to think it. Get yourself off of autopilot. Remember individualization. Everyone is different. Everybody has their own story, right? And so even when you want to lump a group of people together, you're not allowing for somebody to be an individual. The colorblind approach, when people say, oh, I don't see color, you do see color, right? So and I understand that maybe that came from a good place as far as I'm not going to judge anyone based off of the color of their skin, which is great, right? But you see color. And so by not seeing someone's race, by not seeing someone's ethnicity, oh, if I can say it, ethnicity, you are denying just their identity and who they are. And that makes up, that's a big part of who they are. Spend time with people who are different from you. Again, do an audit. If all of your friends and all of your, coworkers and everyone that you spend time with looks like you, I'll just leave it at that. check what you follow, what you watch, what you support. If you find that some things just are not sitting well with you as you're continuing to learn and to grow, that just may not be something that you can participate in anymore. And just being comfortable with being uncomfortable as you're trying to become aware of implicit bias. It might feel really uncomfortable, right, to address some of that stuff, and that's okay. So being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and give yourself grace, right? Give yourself grace and give yourself time to kind of figure that and unpack it. So what's the impact of racism on clients in counseling? So earlier we talked about the impact of racism, but what's the impact of racism of clients on clients in counseling? And so there was an article, and what they talked a lot about was folks are less likely to have access to mental health services, seek out services, receive that needed care. More likely to terminate counseling services. If they do decide to go to counseling, they are more likely to terminate prematurely. Misdiagnosis, right? So being overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. There's several studies that show that Black men are continuously overdiagnosed with schizophrenia. There are studies that show that Black boys are overdiagnosed with ADHD, right? So when, even in assessments, when there's not an awareness of the biases and prejudices, like that's how it comes into our counseling sessions with our clients. Mental health and incarceration. I mean, that's a whole nother class that we can do that I don't think that we're doing this round, but that should definitely be something that we should talk about. Maybe we could talk about it on Thursday with Dr. Newton and Dr. Carroll. And so what do you do about it? Sorry, I skipped one. So that means representation and training programs, right? So graduate programs, reaching out to students who are diverse, a diverse group of students, being very intentional with that. When I think about racism, things were systemically put in place to keep people oppressed. So that doesn't just go away. You don't just snap your fingers and that no longer exists. And well, Jim Crow's over, or, all of these very discriminatory laws are over. So everybody should just be able to get a job and work and do this and do that. No, like things were systemically put in place for people of color for generations and generations. So things have to be systemically put in place to get out of that. Right? It's not just going to happen, so there has to be deliberate effort. So whether that's on the training programs, continued emphasis on cultural competencies, being able to broach those racial differences with clients, again, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, again, being advocates, seeking that supervision, continuing your own personal counseling. That's so important. Every counselor should have a counselor. And then just checking yourself, right? Checking yourself. If you realize that there's certain thoughts that you're having, or you're thinking about people, or you're first, and that's why I do want you all to do that implicit bias test, because it's supposed to be the first thing that pops into your mind when you see a certain picture of someone of a different racial background or a different gender, or whatever test you choose to do. And so if the first thing that pops into your mind is something prejudice and bias, you need to check yourself and check other people that you surround yourself with. So that's that. It's been a pleasure. And I hope that maybe this was just a refresher from some of you. I hope that maybe there were some new things for other folks. I just want to point out that this is a pretty dope PowerPoint template. So I did not do this. I just wanted to leave these credits here of who did this PowerPoint template. I look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday, and thank you for spending time with me. Have a great one.